So, if you look at the global average today for female lawmakers sitting in national parliaments, it's barely 26.5%.
Yeah, 26.5. It's really low.
Right. And I mean, even the wealthiest, most progressive nations on earth, they really struggle to break a third.
They absolutely do.
But in one low-income country, a country that's recovering from an absolute demographic collapse, that number is almost 55%. Women hold the absolute majority. So welcome to the deep dive. I'm so glad you're here with us today because we are looking at a data set that completely shatters how we think about national success and wealth and, well, equality.
Yeah, it forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question, honestly. I mean, if a nation with a fraction of the global average budget can achieve a female majority government, then what is holding everybody else back?
Exactly, because usually when we look at national development, there's this expectation of, like, precision,
Right.
like engineering.
Oh, for sure. The classic GDP model.
Yeah, you look at a country's wealth, the gross domestic product, the line goes up, and the analyst just points and says, there it is, wealth equals development. First you get rich, then you get equal. We really like things to be predictable.
We love predictability.
We do. We like to categorize nations neatly into these boxes like rich and developed or poor and developing.
Right, but then you step into the world of actual human development, the messy, complex realities of how societies recover from trauma or how they distribute power, how they educate their kids. And suddenly that clean, linear equation is just completely broken.
And that is exactly our mission today. We are exploring a massive, really comprehensive data report on Rwanda, spanning all the way from 1990 to 2023. We are going to be living in the metrics of over 3 decades of official United Nations data.
Some really fascinating data, too.
Oh, it's incredible. Specifically, we are going to unpack the Human Development Index, the Gender Inequality Index, and this relatively new metric called the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI.
Which is such a game changer of a metric. But I think it is important to state right up front to you listening right now. Our goal today is entirely impartial.
Yes, absolutely.
We are spanning a massive, incredibly volatile timeline here, which obviously includes the profound abyss of 1994. So we are not here to endorse any specific political ideologies, whether that involves the mechanics of government quotas or specific climate policies.
Right.
Our only job today is to impartially unpack the raw data. We are here to look at the mechanisms of change. Like, how did these numbers actually happen?
Yeah, we just let the numbers do the talking. And right out of the gate, those numbers present this massive counterintuitive paradox. I mean, if you look at the economic reality, Rwanda is a low-income nation. Its per capita income is thousands of dollars below the global average.
Significantly below.
Right. So how does a nation operating with such limited financial capital manage to absolutely crush the global average in political gender equality and human development growth?
Well, to answer that, you really have to understand that they aren't playing the traditional development game.
Because they couldn't, right?
Exactly, they couldn't. To understand their peak in 2023, you have to understand the foundation they were forced to build upon in the mid-1990s.
So let's rewind the clock. Let's look at the historical baseline. Because the term abyss is almost an understatement when you look at the demographic data from 1994.
Yeah, it's hard to even conceptualize.
It really is. The data shows life expectancy in Rwanda plummeting to an unimaginable 12.15 years, barely 12 years old.
Just let that number sit in the room for a second. 12 years.
Okay, but I have to push back on this, or at least ask you for a translation into human reality, because we see numbers like 12 years on a spreadsheet, and it's just hard to process.
It sounds impossible.
Right. Obviously, it doesn't mean every single person literally died on their 12th birthday.
Yeah.
But what does a life expectancy of 12 actually mean for the foundational structure of a village or a town or a whole nation?
It's a really crucial distinction to make. Look, life expectancy at birth is a statistical average. So when an average drops to 12 years, you are looking at a society experiencing catastrophic mass casualty events simultaneously with a massive infant and child mortality.
Wow.
The math simply collapses under that weight. But the human reality of that number, what it looks like on the ground, is what we call a demographic void.
A void, meaning the people who actually run the society, they're gone.
Precisely. Normally, a society's demographic structure looks like a pyramid, right?
Okay.
You have a wide base of young people, then a solid, thick middle section of working-age adults, and it tapers up to a smaller number of the elderly at the top.
That makes sense.
But in 1994, Rwanda's pyramid was fundamentally shattered. The middle of that pyramid, the working age population, was essentially hollowed out.
And here is where it connects directly to our core question about gender, right?
Yeah.
Because the surviving population was not a 50-50 split.
No, it wasn't. The men were overwhelmingly the victims of the historical violence, or they were displaced, or they were imprisoned. So the surviving population was disproportionately female.
Oh, sure.
You had a country where the vast majority of the remaining adults were women, suddenly left in charge of an entirely broken infrastructure.
So if we pull this out of the spreadsheet and put it on the ground, the traditional rules of who participates in the economy just completely evaporated.
Overnight.
Yeah. Like who works in the fields to grow the food? Who rebuilds the houses that were destroyed? Who sits in the local government councils to make decisions?
The women had to do it.
Right. Those rules didn't slowly evolve over a century of progressive policy debates like they did in other countries. They had to change out of sheer absolute necessity.
Necessity is the exact word. It was a forced societal reset. There simply were not enough men left to run the country the way it had been run before. So women had to step into the economic and political void. Not because someone wrote a nice policy paper about equality, but because of raw survival. I mean, if the women didn't harvest the crops, the country starved.
Yeah.
If the women didn't rebuild the markets, the economy stayed dead.
And from that ground zero, the data shows an absolute explosion of recovery. It's often referred to in developmental economics as Rwanda speed, isn't it?
Yes. On to speed. It's a real term.
And if we look at that life expectancy graph again, it doesn't just slowly creep back up to its pre-1994 levels. It soars. By 2023, life expectancy in Rwanda reached almost 68 years, 67.75 to be exact.
Which is closing in rapidly on the global average.
What is the global average right now?
It's roughly 73.3 years. So to jump from 12 to almost 68 in less than 3 decades is one of the most aggressive rebounds in recorded demographic history.
That is just wild. And if we zoom out from just life expectancy and look at the overall Human Development Index, the HDI, just to clarify for anyone new to this term, the UN created the HDI to get away from just looking at money.
Right, because GDP isn't everything.
Exactly. It bundles health, education, and standard of living into one single number, and a perfect score is 1. So in 1995, Rwanda's HDI was incredibly low, sitting around 0.294. But by 2023, it almost doubled, reaching nearly 0.58.
Yeah, 0.578. The absolute value of their HDI grew by nearly 97%.
Almost doubled.
Exactly. But, you know, the true indicator of a society's systemic health isn't just a line going up, it's how the system handles shocks.
Right, because nothing goes up perfectly forever.
Exactly. And the data shows a slight fluctuation around 2013 where the HDI dipped briefly to about 0.499.
Okay, so a little setback.
But immediately following that dip, you see an aggressive, resilient rebound right back onto the upward trajectory. And that bounce back is what tells developmental economists that the underlying foundation is actually solid.
It makes me think about a time you had to rebuild something from scratch. You know, maybe a business or a massive project, even a house after a disaster.
Yeah, it's daunting.
It's terrifying. But when the old foundation is completely destroyed, you are also forced to build a new, sometimes vastly more resilient structure. You don't replicate the flaws of the old foundation because you've seen how easily it broke.
That's a great analogy.
So Rwanda had no choice but to innovate its human capital. They don't have massive oil reserves to fall back on, right? They had to rely entirely on their people.
And when human capital is your only natural resource, you have to optimize every single person. You cannot afford the historical luxury of leaving 50% of your population, the women, on the sidelines.
Which begs the question, how do you actually fuel a recovery that fast? Because, I mean, you can't just pass a law mandating a higher life expectancy.
Oh, if only it were that easy.
Right. People don't just magically live longer because the government says so. You have to invest heavily in the minds of the next generation. And that requires a massive coordinated effort in education.
Education is the engine room of human development. Honestly, without it, every other metric eventually stalls out.
And looking at the education data in this UN report, education in Rwanda acted as this great rapid equalizer. The intentional erasure of the gender gap in schooling is, frankly, one of the most striking things in this entire data set.
It really stands out.
Let's look at a metric called expected years of schooling.
Expected years of schooling, or EYS. It's essentially a projection. It measures the number of years of schooling that a child of school entrance age can expect to receive, assuming the current enrollment rates stay exactly as they are today.
Okay, so it's a projection. So in 1995, a child in Rwanda could only expect about 5.6 years of schooling.
Barely primary school.
Yeah, that is barely enough to learn to read fluently and do basic arithmetic. They weren't even finishing primary school.
It represents a deeply stunted educational horizon. You see, a society with a 5-year expected schooling rate is a society that can really only perform manual labor.
It puts a ceiling on what you can do.
A very low ceiling. It cannot build complex infrastructure, it cannot develop advanced healthcare, and it certainly cannot compete in a globalized economy.
But by 2023, this number skyrocketed to 12.59 years.
Over 12 and a half years.
And the global average is just over 13 years, 13.04. So in 3 decades, they went from severe educational deprivation to knocking on the door of the global average.
And here's the crucial detail that really answers our initial question about equality. If you split that 2023 expectation by gender, the gap is virtually non-existent.
Really? Like totally erased?
Basically, yes. Girls can expect roughly 12.5 years. Boys can expect 12.6 years. The difference is less than a tenth of a year.
That is astonishing.
In a single generation, they completely eradicated the gender gap in basic educational access.
Okay, so that is the expected years of schooling. But the UN report also tracks mean years of schooling. And we really need to spend some time here because the difference between these two metrics explains so much about how countries actually develop.
It's a vital distinction.
Right, so expected years is the promise a nation makes to a child entering kindergarten today. Mean years of schooling is the actual knowledge bank account of the adult population right now. It measures the average number of years of education actually received by people ages 25 and older.
That's a perfect way to conceptualize it. The expected years are future potential, the mean years are current reality, and current reality is incredibly stubborn. It takes a lot longer to change.
Exactly. In 1990, the mean years of schooling in Rwanda was a dismal 1.9 years. Think about that societal bank account. The average adult walking down the street had less than 2 years of formal education.
It's devastating.
But by 2023, it reached nearly 5 years, 4.88 to be exact.
And what's fascinating here is the deeper gender perspective within that mean years data, because we see the true engine of their recovery there. Women's average schooling grew almost threefold, from roughly 1.1 years to 4.5 years.
A 300% increase in the knowledge bank account of the female population. But wait, I can hear people listening to this and doing the math right now.
Oh, I know what you're going to ask.
If expected schooling is over 12 years, why is the mean schooling for adults still under 5 years? That seems like a massive disconnect.
It does seem like a disconnect, but it illustrates perfectly the concept of lag time in human development.
Lag time, okay.
Yeah, building human capital is not like building a bridge where once it's built, you use it the next day. When a nation improves its schools and gets millions of girls into classrooms, which spikes the expected years of schooling, you don't see the macroeconomic benefit immediately.
Because they're still kids.
Exactly. Those girls are sitting at desks. They have to grow up, graduate, enter the workforce, and turn 25 before they start heavily impacting the mean years of schooling metric for the adult population.
Oh, so it's a generational investment.
Mm-hmm.
You are planting a forest that you won't be able to harvest for 20 years. You have to spend the money on teachers and books today, knowing the GDP won't see the return until those kids grow up.
Precisely. But developmental economists know that keeping girls in secondary school is arguably the single most potent economic driver a developing nation possesses. The compounding returns are staggering.
That's a powder how.
Well, a girl with secondary education is significantly more likely to enter the formal labor market. She is more likely to earn a higher wage, and crucially, she is vastly more likely to reinvest that income into her own children's health and education.
Which creates an intergenerational compounding effect.
Exact.
Okay, so education empowers the mind. It sets up that compounding economic effect. But sending a girl to secondary school is really only half the battle.
Yeah.
Because you can have a brilliant mind, but if the physical body is vulnerable, if the public health infrastructure fails you, all that educational potential is just erased. I mean, if the nearest health clinic is a 2-day walk away, a complication in childbirth will destroy all that human capital in a single night.
It's just absolute trash.
And that is the physical barrier Rwanda hit next.
And specifically, the barrier of maternal and adolescent health. Because how a society treats its mothers and its adolescent girls is a direct, undeniable indicator of systemic development. It reveals where a country actually spends its money.
Let's look at the health data because we have two massive metrics here. The first is the maternal mortality ratio. This measures the number of women who die from pregnancy-related causes per 100,000 live births.
Yes.
In 1995, Rwanda's maternal mortality was incredibly high, sitting at roughly 156. By 2023, it dropped to 25.9.
I want to pause on that drop because decreasing maternal mortality isn't just about handing out vitamins. It is incredibly difficult, logistically complex work.
All right, wait, I really want to push back here because how is a drop like that even possible? You just said they have a fraction of the global average budget. You can't just legislate doctors into existence. Are we sure this data is reliable, or is it just a massive shift in how they report the numbers?
That's a fair question. But yes, the data is robust and it's heavily vetted by international health organizations like the UN and the WHO. And the how is actually the most fascinating part of this whole story.
Okay, tell me how.
To drop maternal mortality from 156 to 25 without a massive Western-style budget requires immense structural innovation. It means they didn't just build a few shiny, expensive hospitals in the capital city of Kigali and call it a day.
Because a shiny hospital in the capital does absolutely nothing for a woman in labor in a rural village.
Exactly. It requires a decentralized approach. It requires a functioning cold chain, meaning refrigerated transport and storage, to keep medicines viable in rural areas.
Which is hard without a perfect electrical grid.
Very hard. It requires paving road infrastructure, so an ambulance or a transport vehicle can actually reach a clinic in an emergency. It requires a massive blood bank system.
And didn't they do something really unique with blood delivery?
Yes. In Rwanda's case, they famously pioneered the use of drone delivery networks. Companies like Zipline. They use drones to parachute bags of blood into remote rural clinics within minutes of an emergency, basically leapfrogging the need for perfect highways entirely.
Oh, wow. So a drop to 25 is a structural triumph. It proves the plumbing of the society is working.
That's a good way to put it.
Now pair that with the second health metric, the adolescent birth rate. This measures births per 1,000 women ages 15 to 19. This dropped from roughly 57 in 1990 down to 30.7 in 2023.
And if we connect this adolescent birth rate to the bigger picture, it explains everything.
How so? Picture a rural village where the local school is suddenly packed with teenage girls who, a generation ago, would have already been married. Because they are in the classroom, the maternity ward down the road is empty of teenagers.
That is the exact mechanism. We are seeing the physical results of the education data we just discussed. An adolescent girl who stays in school until she is 18 naturally delays childbirth.
Right.
Because she is engaged in education, the adolescent birth rate gets pushed down.
So it's a domino effect. Education delays childbirth. Delaying childbirth allows a young woman's body to physically mature, which fundamentally lowers the biological risk of pregnancy.
Yes, very much so.
And lowering the biological risk directly helps lower the maternal mortality ratio. The metrics are totally talking to each other.
They are completely intertwined. Furthermore, dropping maternal mortality requires a society that prioritizes women's lives in its political budgeting.
The budget, yeah.
You have to make the active decision to spend your very limited national funds on rural maternal clinics, on community health workers, on drone blood delivery, instead of spending it on, say, military hardware or massive vanity monuments in the capital.
You put your money where your values are.
Yes. A national budget is simply a mathematical expression of a nation's values. To get maternal mortality down to 25 requires immense, sustained political will. Someone has to be in the room demanding that the budget goes to the rural mothers.
Which brings us perfectly to the core of this entire deep dive. How did women actually get control of that political budget? How do they ensure the funds went to those rural clinics and those secondary schools? Let's look at the actual power structures.
Yeah.
Because this is where Rwanda completely separates itself from the rest of the world.
Yeah, we need to look at the Gender Development Index and then the Gender Inequality Index.
Okay, the Gender Development Index, or GDI. This basically takes the Human Development Index and measures the gap between men and women. A GDI of 1 means perfect statistical equality.
Right.
Rwanda's GDI is over 0.92. Which is incredible because the female human development score has reached 92% of the male score. They are closing the gap at an astonishing rate.
But, you know, the GDI is really just the foundation. It tells us women are living as long and getting as much education as men. But the real shockwave comes from the Gender Inequality Index, which factors in actual empowerment, and the labor market. Like, who actually holds the power?
And this is where we return to that legendary statistic from the very beginning of our conversation. Nearly 55% of parliament seats are held by women. 54.7 officially.
It is math.
To put that in historical context, in 1990, it was only 17%, which honestly was still higher than many Western nations at the time, but definitely a minority.
What you want to look at on the timeline is the massive structural leap that happened around 2003.
Right. If you track the parliament seats over time, the number just hovers in the teens and 20s for a decade. And then in 2003, bam, it jumps to 35% almost overnight.
That jump coincides precisely with the drafting and adoption of Rwanda's new constitution.
Okay, so I have to play devil's advocate here.
Please do.
Because I know exactly what people are thinking when they hear this. When people hear about constitutional quotas or sudden 30-point jumps in political seats, they get very skeptical.
Of course.
They wonder, is this genuine empowerment or is it just a top-down mandate? Like, is it window dressing to look good for international donors while the actual power remains with a small group of men behind closed doors?
It's a very valid concern.
Because you can mandate that women sit in the chairs, but you can't mandate that their voices actually matter.
It is the most common and, frankly, the most important question to ask when you see any quota system in international development. We have to thoughtfully unpack the mechanics of this.
Let's unpack it. How did this actually happen?
Well, the 2003 Constitution mandated that at least 30% of parliamentary seats and other government decision-making bodies be held by women. That was the mandated floor.
Okay, 30%.
Right. That constitutional quota forced the initial door open. It broke the historical monopoly on political power.
But 30% isn't 55%.
Exactly. And that is the crucial insight that answers your skepticism. If this were merely window dressing for international donors, the number would hover right at 30.1%.
Ah, I see what you mean.
Right. The political machine would do the absolute bare minimum to satisfy the law and not a fraction of a percent more. But look at the sustained growth over the next 2 decades, climbing from the mandated 30 to 45%, then past 50, all the way to nearly 55%, well beyond the quota.
Right. 25% above the requirement.
That organic growth suggests a deep, authentic cultural shift, not just a legal mandate.
And it's not just happening in the ivory tower of the parliament in the capital, right? You have to look at the economic reality on the ground to see if it matches.
Correct. The data shows female labor force participation is remarkably high. The report highlights it running at roughly 54%, significantly above global averages. They're heavily integrated into the economic machinery of the country.
So they aren't just in parliament.
No, women aren't just in parliament. They're running businesses, managing farms, and leading local councils.
So if we synthesize this back to our earlier discussion about the 1994 demographic collapse, when women are the primary rebuilders of an economy, political representation eventually has to align with economic reality.
It has to, yes.
You can't have women running the agricultural sector, running the local markets, rebuilding the community schools, and then accept being shut out of the room where the national budget for those farms and schools is decided.
The quota was the spark. It was the legal mechanism that shattered the glass ceiling. But the economic reality, the fact that women were holding the country together, was the fuel that kept the fire burning, pushing that representation all the way to 55%. The political superstructure simply adapted to the demographic and economic base.
But we promised you a deep dive today, not a fairy tale. And the job of a deep dive is to look at the shadows as well as the light. The data we've discussed so far shows incredible peaks. World-leading gender parity in parliament, massive leaps in life expectancy. But it also reveals deeply entrenched valleys. And this brings us to the reality check and the heavy, stubborn cost of poverty.
This is where we really have to balance the narrative. We cannot just celebrate the peaks. We have to explore the severe limitations of Rwanda's economic reality. Specifically, we need to talk about inequality and multidimensional poverty.
We keep mentioning the Human Development Index, which sits at roughly 0.58. But the UN report includes another metric, the Inequality-Adjusted HDI, or IHDI.
The Inequality-Adjusted HDI is a brilliant, if sobering, metric. It takes the standard human development score and essentially penalizes it for inequality within the country.
How does that work in practice?
Well, if a country's wealth, health, and education are perfectly evenly distributed among all its citizens, the standard index and the Inequality-Adjusted index are exactly the same.
Okay, perfect equality.
Right. But if all the wealth and good schools are hoarded by a tiny percentage of the population at the top, the adjusted index drops significantly to reflect the harsh reality of the average person.
And in Rwanda, that penalty is severe. While the standard index is 0.58, the inequality adjusted index drops all the way down to nearly zero point 0.4, 0.399.
That's a massive drop.
It represents an overall loss of nearly 31% of their human development potential, due entirely to internal inequality.
Nearly a third of their developmental achievement is essentially erased by how unevenly it is distributed across the population.
The report actually breaks down where this loss comes from. Income inequality claims a staggering 44.3% of the loss in that specific dimension. Then education inequality claims 27.4%.
It really shows that while the national averages have improved beautifully, the gap between the richest citizens in the capital of Kigali and the poorest citizens in remote rural areas remains vast.
Which leads us to a concept called the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or MPI. And I want to spend some time here because this really changes how we think about being poor.
It's not just about money.
Exactly. This isn't just about how many dollars a day you make. Multidimensional poverty looks at actual physical deprivations in health, education, and living standards.
Because a lack of cash is only one symptom of poverty. The multidimensional index looks at your actual life. Does your roof leak when it rains? Do you have access to electricity? Or does your day end when the sun goes down? Is your child malnourished? Do you have an indoor toilet?
And the recent data gives Rwanda a multidimensional poverty rate of 48%. The MPI value is 0.231. I want you to hear that human translation. Almost half the country is still living in multidimensional poverty.
Almost half. And the data breaks down what exactly drives this poverty. The highest contributors aren't necessarily what you'd intuitively think.
What do you mean?
Well, it's not just a lack of physical assets like a bicycle or a radio. The highest contributor to their poverty index is years of schooling at nearly 21%.
Wait, but we just spent a huge amount of time talking about the miracle of their education system, with kids expecting over 12 years of school.
Right, but remember the lag time we discussed earlier.
Oh, right. The adults.
Exactly. The recent gains in expected years for children haven't reached the adult population yet. That historical lack of schooling for the adults who are currently trying to support families is still the heaviest anchor holding those families in poverty.
That makes total sense. A parent who only had 2 years of education in the 1980s is going to struggle to lift their family out of poverty today, even if their daughter is currently doing really well in secondary school?
Precisely. They are structurally locked out of higher-paying jobs.
Okay, so following historical education, the next biggest driver of poverty is nutrition, contributing 16.6%. And then at 11.7% is cooking fuel.
Cooking fuel. That is such a crucial, often overlooked metric in development.
Why is cooking fuel a poverty metric? Explain that.
Because if you don't have electricity or a clean gas stove, you rely on rudimentary biomass. You burn wood or charcoal or animal dung indoors to cook your meals.
Oh, wow. And that destroys your lungs.
Exactly. The respiratory diseases caused by burning biomass indoors kill millions of people globally every year. And it disproportionately affects women and small children who are in the home while the cooking is happening.
That's horrifying.
And furthermore, it creates massive time poverty. Women and girls spend hours every single day foraging for firewood instead of working in the formal economy or studying.
Here's where it gets really interesting, this friction in the data that makes this whole deep dive so compelling. You can have a brilliant, empowered woman representing you in Parliament. She might be crafting incredible national policy.
Right.
But if you as a rural citizen are still relying on charcoal to cook your dinner, coughing through the smoke every single night, the macro-level development hasn't fully reached your kitchen.
Which brings us to the fundamental limit of policy. This raises an important question. How does a low-income, middle-development country bridge that gap? How do you connect macro-level political equality with micro-level household poverty?
Right, because you can optimize your policies endlessly. You can draft the best constitution in the world. You can have perfect gender parity in your government. You can mandate equality all day long.
But eventually you hit a wall. Eventually you need raw capital.
Money.
Yes, you need hard currency to lay down hundreds of miles of electrical grids so women don't have to cook with charcoal. You need capital to build advanced secondary schools in every single district and pay salaries to highly trained teachers. You need money to pave the roads so the crops can get to market without rotting in the mud.
And this lack of raw capital is the absolute ceiling holding Rwanda back right now. Let's look at the gross national income per capita. The GNI. Rwanda sits just under $3,000, 2,970,
Compare that to the global average GNI.
which is over $20,000, 20,327.
So they are achieving all of these life expectancy and education miracles on roughly 15% of the global average income. It's an efficiency miracle, honestly, but efficiency has a hard limit.
Consider a startup company. You can have the best company culture in the world. You can have a brilliant, diverse board of directors. You can have a perfect mission statement.
Sure.
But if you don't actually have revenue, if you don't have cash flow, the entry-level employees are still going to struggle to pay their rent. Structural change like passing a quota or writing a constitution is relatively fast. You draft the document, you sign the paper, it's done.
But infrastructural change like building a national power grid is painstakingly slow.
And incredibly expensive.
Very expensive.
So if economic growth, raw hard capital, is the missing piece to pull that remaining 48% out of poverty, how do they achieve it? Historically, there is a very established, very dirty playbook for how nations get rich.
Yes, there is. Historically, nations get rich by exploiting nature. You extract resources, you burn fossil fuels, and you externalize the environmental cost. You industrialize quickly, and you industrialize dirtily.
The classic industrial revolution model. You clear-cut the forests, you build the smoke-belching factories, you burn the coal, you get rich, and you worry about the environment a century later once you can finally afford to clean it up.
That is precisely how the global north developed. But the data shows Rwanda is playing a completely different game, which leads us to the ultimate plot twist in our data stack.
The Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI, the PHDI. This is a relatively new metric from the UN, and it completely reframes the concept of success.
The UN realized that the traditional Human Development Index was flawed because it rewards countries for getting wealthy and living longer, but completely ignores the damage they do to the Earth to achieve that wealth. A country could have a perfect score while actively destroying the climate. So the Planetary Pressures Index takes a country's standard score and adjusts it downward, penalizing it based on its ecological footprint, specifically its carbon dioxide emissions and its material footprint.
Let's look at what happens when you apply this ecological penalty. When the UN adjusts the global average for planetary pressures, the global average drops by over 10%. The world as a whole takes a massive penalty because our current model of development is highly toxic to the planet.
But then you look at Rwanda's penalty.
Right. Rwanda's standard index, which we established, is 0.578, barely flinches. When adjusted for planetary pressure, it drops to 0.567. That is a penalty of less than 2%, 1.9% exactly.
A 10% loss for the globe, a less than 2% loss for Rwanda.
Imagine a visual where Rwanda is represented by a single green growing tree. It's putting down roots, it's growing taller, and the global average is a massive smoke-belching factory complex suffocating under its own exhaust.
That's a powerful image.
To understand why Rwanda is just a tree and not a factory, let's look at the extreme ecological contrast in the data.
The per capita numbers here are staggering.
Let's look at carbon dioxide emissions per capita. In Rwanda, the average person emits roughly 0.1 tons of CO2, 0.109. The global average is over 4.5 tons.
I want to make sure you caught that contrast, 0.1 versus 4.5.
The global average is nearly 40 times higher.
40 times. And it's not just carbon in the atmosphere. Look at the material footprint per capita. This measures the sheer physical mass of raw materials extracted from the earth to meet domestic consumption demands. Minerals, biomass, fossil fuels, everything dug up or chopped down.
Rwanda consumes about 3.4 tons per capita. The global average is nearly 13 tons, 12.7 to be exact.
This brings us to a concept I like to call the ecological cost of development. Historically, the wealthy nations of the world bought their high life expectancy, their advanced university systems, their massive hospitals, by heavily taxing the planet.
They borrowed from the future.
They essentially borrowed from the Earth's future to fund their present development. They racked up a massive ecological debt.
But Rwanda currently operates in an incredibly rare, low-pressure development model. They have managed to double their life expectancy, eradicate the gender gap in schooling, and achieve world-leading female political empowerment, all without passing the ecological bill to the planet,
They are doing it with a clean slate.
which is an incredible achievement. However, it also presents their defining existential challenge for the future.
Right, because we just talked about the 48% of the country still living in multidimensional poverty. We just talked about how they desperately need hard capital to build infrastructure, to get people off charcoal cooking fuel, to pave the roads.
Exactly. The question for Rwanda is, can they increase their per capita income? Can they solve those deep poverty issues without inflating their carbon and material footprint?
It's the ultimate test.
Can they achieve high-income status while remaining a green tree, or will the pressure of poverty eventually force them to build the smoke-belching factories?
Can you leapfrog the dirty industrial phase of development entirely? It is the million-dollar question for the entire developing world, and Rwanda is essentially acting as a global benchmark right now.
They are a living laboratory for whether green, sustainable, equitable development is actually possible from the ground up.
It is a delicate, precarious balance. I mean, building an electrical grid requires copper, it requires steel, it requires energy. Doing that sustainably is infinitely harder than just burning cheap coal.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We've gone from the depths of demographic collapse and a 12-year life expectancy up into the halls of a female majority parliament, back down into the rural kitchens relying on charcoal, and out into the global atmosphere tracking carbon emissions.
It's a lot to process.
It is. So let's bring all these disparate threads, gender, trauma, poverty, and ecology together into a cohesive takeaway. Let's summarize what we can call the Rwanda model.
If we synthesize everything the data has shown us across these 3 decades, it really rests on 3 distinct pillars.
Pillar number 1, inclusive growth. The data proves that gender parity isn't just a political talking point or a progressive luxury that you worry about after you get rich.
Right.
In Rwanda, it is the core developmental blueprint. By forcing the door open with a constitutional quota, they catalyzed the cultural shift that led the world, resulting in nearly 55% of parliamentary seats held by women. They tapped into 100% of their human capital because they had to.
Pillar number 2, the efficiency miracle. They have achieved near global average life expectancy and absolute parity in school enrollment, all while operating on less than 15% of the global average income.
Which is mind-blowing.
Through structural innovations like prioritizing rural clinics and deploying medical drones, they're wringing every drop of developmental progress out of every single dollar they have.
And pillar number 3, the sustainable path. They are pulling off this efficiency miracle without burning the house down. Their planetary pressure penalty is a tiny fraction of the global average. They are a model of low-carbon, low-material footprint development.
But, and this is crucial, we cannot forget the lingering challenge.
We cannot ignore the friction. The nearly 50% multidimensional poverty rate is the dragon Rwanda still must slay. The fact that historical lack of schooling is still anchoring families down and that basic necessities like clean cooking fuel are still lacking for so many shows that while the structural framework of equality is built, the infrastructural reality is still under heavy construction.
It reminds us that human development is never truly finished. It is an ongoing, strenuous, daily process of bridging the gap between national averages on a spreadsheet and the individual lived experiences of people in rural villages.
And that brings us to the end of our dive. But as always, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought, something to mull over on your commute or while you're making dinner tonight.
Look at everything we've unpacked today. Look at the timeline from 1990 to 2023. If a nation, working with incredibly limited financial resources, recovering from one of the most profound demographic voids of the 20th century, can design a society that fundamentally values female political voices, pushes life expectancy up by over 50 years, and treads so lightly on the earth that their ecological penalty is negligible, it forces us to look in the mirror.
Yeah.
It forces us to look at the wealthiest nations in the world, the ones with the massive national incomes, the ones dominating the global economy, and ask, what is our excuse? Are we actually developed in a holistic, sustainable, equitable sense? Or are we just rich?
Wow. Are we actually developed or are we just rich? I want you, the listener, to take that question and apply it. Look at the metrics of your own community. Look at your own business, your own workplace, or even your own life. Are you confusing the accumulation of wealth with actual sustainable development? Are you confusing a high bank account balance with actual equality? At the start of this deep dive, we talked about how we like development to be clean, binary, a straight line where wealth equals success. But Rwanda's data breaks that model entirely. It shows us that true development is murkier, it's harder, but it's also incredibly dynamic. It shows that you can build a more equal, more sustainable house, even if you have to build it from the absolute ground up. Keep questioning the numbers, keep looking for the human stories hiding inside the data, and we will see you on the next deep dive.